Hey guys, what's up? So coming at you from a very sunny Tianjin, which is a city of around 11 million people, roughly half an hour by train from Beijing. Normally I live in Beijing, but I came here about 3 weeks ago because I had to support our local office here for up to a couple of months. And basically right now it is quite hard to travel between Tianjin and Beijing because the COVID situation in Beijing is a little bit worse than Tianjin, or well, it was last week, which means that you have to do like a 1 week quarantine when you arrive here. So it's difficult for me right now to travel back and forth between Beijing and Tianjin. But actually, when I came here, there were no cases in Tianjin about 3 weeks ago, but now there are. So I got tested, for example, this morning. I got tested Friday night, as well as the weekend before. And currently they're roughly at about 30-40 cases per day in Tianjin, all around the city. They had an outbreak here in February this year with similar numbers, and then they closed down the city more or less for about a month or 2 months. And after that they went down to zero. So Tianjin was a very safe city in April, early May, but now it's changed again. So I guess Tianjin will soon be considered like a high-risk zone, and the government is definitely very nervous. So the question is, does zero COVID work? And what's the plan going ahead for China's epidemic prevention policy? You could say that the policy worked very well for a long time. China had an outbreak in February 2020. They had some lockdowns and some things to prevent spread, which were quite harsh, but they worked. And after that, pretty much until a few months ago, China was open. It was possible to travel anywhere. You had to wear a mask, and you had to use this like tracking health app to make sure that you had a green health code, which meant that you hadn't been close to anybody who was infected or in some high-risk area. But in general, it worked really well. You could go to restaurants, you could go to bars, nightclubs, you could be on high-speed trains and whatever. Life was normal here. Whereas the rest of the world was going through a very tough time with lockdowns and very high mortality numbers. So China was naturally patting itself on the back. Things were working very well. The strategy was a big success for the government. And then Hong Kong happened earlier this year, where basically the whole city got infected. You had one of the world's highest mortality rates at around 5%. And that was a bit of a disaster, of course. And then gradually Omicron began spreading also to the mainland, first in South China, and then in Shanghai, and then also in Beijing and Tianjin and all around China, basically. So right now we have some serious community spread all around the country, and the government is trying to find a way to deal with that. Of course, the most well-known example right now recently is in Shanghai and what's happening there. And of course, a lot of people overseas and also people living in Shanghai are very critical about what happened there. But what you could say is that the government there didn't really follow the zero COVID policy. So for example, for a long period in March, they had cases of 40, 50, 60 cases per day for several weeks, but they didn't close down the subways, they didn't close down different city districts. They kept everything open. I was talking to a colleague actually during that time, and he told me about this, that yeah, like we have 60 cases a day and in 10 different districts in Shanghai, but life is normal, everything is open and everything is fine. So this was allowed to go on for a couple of weeks, and then at the end of March, as we all know, they started the so-called 3-day lockdown, which is still going on today, 2 months later. So there's a feeling, I think, in the government and also among other Chinese, that the Shanghai government, they kind of abused the trust of the central government. They didn't follow the strict policies. That's why they had an explosion of cases, and that's why they have themselves to blame. Other local governments right now around China are trying to enforce the zero COVID policy much more strictly. So that's why in Tianjin, for example, they're not testing everybody on a regular basis. They are locking down specific districts where they have more cases. If they have more cases in an area, like you have to get tested every day, 3 days in a row, and so on. The problem they're facing is that Omicron is incredibly contagious, and that people who have symptoms, who believe they are sick, they will simply, in many cases, avoid to get tested. They'll simply stay home because they are afraid to go into a quarantine camp after what they saw with the quarantine camps in Shanghai. So right now the government is facing a difficult situation for sure. What we have seen is that in some cities like Langfang, for example, which had serious caseloads a couple of months ago, the situation today is better, so they have improved. In Jilin, which was also under lockdown for a long time, things have improved. Tianjin improved for a couple of months until now. So they have been able, with this very costly and difficult strategy, to actually reduce the spread of Omicron, but they're still fighting it continuously because there's still new cases popping up, and if they're too late by a few days or a few weeks, you already have massive community spread. So they are still trying, and they're doing their best. It's at a very high expense in terms of testing costs and lockdown costs, but it's still a fight that they haven't lost completely. Of course, one could argue that it's only a matter of time before everybody gets it, because at the end of the day, Omicron is not getting less contagious. The new versions are coming out, BA0001 or whatever. It's always about 25-50% more contagious than the last version, and there's always a new version, I don't know, every 3 or 4 months. So it is definitely an uphill battle, but the government is showing no signs to give up. What's encouraging is that I've heard from friends in Tianjin, for example, that the government is now encouraging people above 60 to get vaccinated, although there is a lot of concern from that generation that the vaccine might have side effects. So if they can avoid it, they avoid it. And they still believe that the government can control with zero COVID. Another problem, of course, the government has is that the Chinese vaccines are much less efficient at preventing severe illness or death than the Western mRNA vaccines. China is trying to develop some of their own mRNA vaccines. They've also purchased a lot from BioNTech, but they have not deployed them yet. And as of now, there's no plan when they will deploy them. If you imagine that you have a very weak vaccine like the one China has today, which has basically been the same since the outbreak of COVID, and by some sources it's not at all efficient against Omicron, then you will have something like a 5% mortality rate in China, which is also what you had in Hong Kong, and then you will have at least 5 million mortalities only in China pretty quickly, maybe within 6 to 12 months. So the government is doing its best to avoid that, and right now actually they don't really have a choice. All they can do is try to slow down the spread. By doing that, they will have less severe cases, which they can manage. They will not overwhelm the hospital system. And at one point, they might also have their own mRNA vaccine, which they can deploy and then reduce the mortality rate. So is it working or not? It is working because it's slowing down the spread for sure, but spread is still happening. It seems unavoidable that it will keep spreading. It's coming at a very high cost to society. By some estimates, if they keep up this very regular testing of everybody, let's say once every 3 days or every 2 days or whatever, it will cost something like 7 to 10% of the Chinese GDP, which is more than they pay for their entire defense budget. And some cities, like in Jilin, for example, the cost is already at around 7% because they have these very regular tests, and of course also the lockdowns, which additionally reduces, tax income and creates a lot of unemployment. So for sure, it's a tough situation. We have to hope that they know what they're doing and that they will somehow find a way out of this. Right now, it's not going super well, but it's still working. So anyway, feel free to give your comments, how you see it and what you believe China could do better. That's all for now. Okay, take care guys.